Hello and welcome to another webinar with me, Conrad Bennett, a longtime property manager and sales agent that recognizes the dynamics of the market. A lot of times we're having opportunities to talk to our clients about the opportunities to keep and hold the property, but eventually the conversations are going to circle around to finding that exit strategy. And quite frankly, the dynamic shifts. There's a lot of things that we want to make sure that begin to align to make sure that that makes sense. And the best part to have these conversations are well enough in advance, not after the tenant vacates, not after we've signed a new lease extension. And so today I have the opportunity to bring Tom Zorc into this conversation. Tom and I have worked together for several decades at this point, dare I say it. But it's ultimately a great opportunity to have that conversation and discuss that dynamic to be able to see how things are progressing. And while my focus has always been property management, Tom, along with a lot of other agents, give me that insight into what the sales market's looking like and gives us the opportunity to give proper guidance to a lot of our clients. So, Tom, why don't you tell everybody that's joined us today a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I've been with EJF for, as you said, decades. It was about 25 years ago that I joined as a sales agent. I also have some background in property management and construction as well. But a sales agent since 2001 at EJF, and then the director of sales since 2004. Obviously, managing as many rentals as we do, I have conversations all the time with owners about selling properties. We've had every experience you can imagine with tenants, selling with tenants in place, or at least strategizing in advance how a sale is going to go with you when you have a tenant, maybe coming near the lease end date. So, happy to share today all my experience and advice that I have.
Well, I'll take that as a nice little segment because, eventually, whether or not you're working with investments, considering getting into them, have family members that do, lots of agents, lots of investors, there will inevitably be a time where you may be looking to get rid of the property. And so when we get these calls from owners, a lot of the conversations start off pretty straightforward until we get into the specifics. And so this is going to be a general overview of a lot of the things that you need to be considering as you go through those next stages of a property life cycle. I'm going to leave a lot of time at the end for some questions, but ultimately, between our experience and the situations that we've seen, and as Tom had mentioned, we have seen a lot of different scenarios. And so we really want to dissect some of the basics to be able to give owners, our clients, the real estate agents that we all work with, some direction in terms of what makes sense there. So, like I said, we'll tackle some questions at the tail end. So, let's go over the basics, Tom. I mean, when there's times when we have owners that reach out, and there are times when things do and do not make sense, regardless of what it is. But in DC, there are good times, and there may be others that are not so great. So, why don't you expand upon some of the things that you dissect when we're looking at the next stage of the life of a property?
Yeah, so as you were saying, Conrad, we have these conversations all the time with sellers over, what's involved with selling in DC. So, there, besides the obvious thing, like what are the market conditions that are present? We're looking at the lease term and, what type of lease are you using? These are all sort of the basic, issues that we look at first. And there's, I think what we encounter a lot of times with buyers and with buyers agents is confusion over the process. How's it going to work? I mean, DC law has changed many times over the years as far as, the exact rules governing a sale of a tenant property. So, with this, it's really about understanding the process, managing the expectations of the seller, explaining the process to buyers and buyers agents so that they understand, how it's going to work, and recognizing that, with some types of buyers, it's maybe not a good fit for buying a rental property because they might be on a short timeline. And with the notice provisions, which we'll get into more on that later, but you're typically looking at, for an owner occupant buyer, a 90-day notice to vacate. before the property will become available. So really, it's just kind of understanding how the process works and working through to what is to achieve the best result.
Perfect. And so, sometimes maybe the tenant may be on month to month. Sometimes they've just entered into an agreement. Sometimes, the owner might be looking to hold on to it for 5 years. You never know. And so it's good to be able to go through that and ultimately having those conversations to make sure that everybody is on the same page. Um,
Exactly.
right. And so, of course, that also has to go along with the market conditions, right? And so, a lot of the times when the lease cycles are coming through, or the tenant may vacate or beginning to consider it, sometimes the markets aren't that great. And you should be considering a lease extension as opposed to troubleshooting it or even trying to impose too much of an increase that may jeopardize them moving out if the market isn't going to be conducive to the potential sale should they vacate, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Um, so let's talk about tenant cooperation. Ultimately, showing places that become a little more challenging because of the condition the tenants are keeping it is a factor. So, knowing what the place looks like, knowing what the tenant's expectations are. I mean, communication is generally the key for just about any conversation or a relationship like this. And so, why don't you tell us a little bit about some of the scenarios you've seen where owners have reached out and said, "Hey, I think I want to sell a unit with the tenant in place," but when you get in, you start seeing some things that may not make it as marketable as one would like.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the first conversation that I have with the owner, just to kind of back up a bit, the first thing I want to do is take a look at the lease, see how that's structured, find out where the tenant is in their term. Is it month to month? Are they coming up for renewal? What is the rent they're paying? So those are the kind of the first basic questions. But once we've had conversations with the owner, and they're interested in selling, then I'm going to go ahead and set up a time to see the property, meet with the tenant. I think it's very important to meet with the tenant in person. Not just have a phone call and go in when they're not there. I think it's important to see how the unit looks, how they maintain it, what's the condition. You can talk to the tenant about, what the condition is. They know better than anyone. They know better than the owner because they've been living there. And so you really kind of want to establish, what the condition is so you can repair anything that needs to be repaired or disclose it before going on the market. You want to see how they keep the place. Are they neat? If it's a tenant who's been in a studio apartment for 15 years, you know that they're going to have a lot of stuff. It's just we accumulate things over time. That's just the way it goes. So, but are they very neat? Do they have nice furniture? Is it a rental group house where you've had, 15 years of tenants cycling in and out and there's all sorts of, mixture of furniture there and it's just not going to show so well. So you really got to understand how the units looks because this impacts the value. This impacts photographs. This impacts any video you might take. Everyone's looking online these days. That's the first time they're going to see a property. So if you have a place that isn't going to show well because of the way that the unit looks, you've got to know the condition. So that's very important to establish early on.
Yeah. All right, so that's a great framework for the next part of this because when we start looking at the property, obviously the marketability is a big factor. If an owner is selling a vacant unit, there's opportunities to get in that may not be as restricted when the tenants live in there. The condition which the tenants are keeping it may be different than if it were to be staged. And so, we're not pushing people to sell, but the most important thing that we tell owners when selling is to always have the right answers. And so sometimes continuing the rent may be the smarter financial decision, but we want to know what the place looks like, what the tenants' expectations are, what they're doing, and of course over the years we've had some changes to the TOPA requirements, which has essentially phased out. So I'll go through some of the front end stuff that you started to talk about. Obviously, in DC and all jurisdictions, Maryland, Virginia, if you sign a lease, you need to make sure that you essentially adhere to those terms, right? It's a mutual agreement that says, hey, you're going to lease the property out from this date to this date. And that's something that you're going to need to observe and commit to. There are extraneous circumstances that may shift that dynamic, but it has to be a mutually agreeable break if you're going to shift a direction, right?
That's correct.
Um, we want to look at that market rent. And I say this especially with it being a tenant occupied unit that you're potentially looking to sell, because investors are going to look at what that rent is and whether or not it's in line with market. And so just having an understanding of what you're charging currently, or what you have the potential of charging at a potential renewal date versus where that lines up with what market rents are, is going to be a critical conversation. If and it can go both ways. Sometimes you may be charging under market. There may certainly be situations where you're charging above market. And if that tenant does end up vacating, the potential investor, if it's going to be an investor, will be focusing on those numbers, because ultimately they're going to want to get what they're expecting to make those numbers work, right?
That's
Um,
right.
let's talk access provisions, right? And notice requirements, because this is a big part. In DC specific, got to give 48 hours notice. Going after hours without consent could become problematic, especially nights, weekends. And I think everybody has the perception that open houses all are on Sunday, right? And so without the tenant's consent to be able to do this, that's going to potentially restrict access, restrict the showings, and ultimately making sure that the tenant has and maintains it in a presentable manner is going to be critical for that decision process. Um, you need to make sure that you give those tenants advance notice in writing, right? Text, email, get something to substantiate it, make sure that they're going to be on board with it. And when we look at those leases, most jurisdictions do have something written in so that at the tail end of the lease, 30, 60, 90 days, and it depends per jurisdiction, but you have the capacity to put it on the lockbox to start doing the showings if you're going that route. But again, it goes back to the communication with the tenant, setting reasonable expectations, and being able to understand what their ultimate plans are. I can recall one sale that we worked on, I think, together, where as soon as we had reached out to the tenants to discuss the owner's intentions, they're like, "Sweet, this is great. We actually just put in an offer on another property, right? And we didn't know how we were going to handle it." And so sometimes they could work out well like that. There will certainly be other ends of the spectrum where tenants have been there for 15, 20 years, and the prospect of moving is a lot more challenging for them to digest, right? And
Yeah.
so, as you mentioned, digging into the condition of the unit is critical, making sure that it does look good and show well, knowing what those tenants' plans and expectations are. And you can't really have these things over text and email. I mean, I call me old fashioned, but I think that conversation, like you said, physically meeting with them, and discussing what this will do to play out is important, but mostly because you need to make sure that there's going to be cooperation, right? And they need to be
Yeah.
willing to do so. If it is going to be problematic, if it's going to be confrontational, it's best to reassess
Yes.
more
The
often
last
than
thing
not.
you want to do is be showing the unit to or the house to people to potential buyers, and you've got an adversarial relationship with the tenant, and they may be confused about the process. So that's again why it's so important to meet with the tenant in advance. You learn so much information. You learn information about the unit, its condition. You learn about what their plans might be, as you said. Sometimes you reach out and they're already thinking of leaving anyway, which can
Mhm.
shift your planning, your strategy with when to list the market. If they're going to be leaving soon, then you could just go ahead and wait to list until after they've moved out. So yeah, having these dialogue with the tenants, being respectful to them. You don't want to allow them to completely dictate unreasonable showing terms as far as just going 1 day a week or something like that. But you try to work around their schedule, figure out, what their work environment, are they working from home? Are they out? Their good times of the day. So it's good to have these conversations with the tenants and, establish what makes sense as far as access and then also what their long-term plans are as far as staying in the unit or, are they potentially planning on leaving anyway?
Yeah. So making sure that the stars align. So dig into the market conditions, and the financial reality, because as we review, current sales and activity in the neighborhood, you need to make sure that it also makes financial sense. So please dig into all of the stuff that you do when we're looking to help an owner value the property.
Yeah, so you're looking at the broader market conditions, but you're also looking at the more focused market conditions. I mean, in DC, in 2020 to 2022, the market was great pretty much everywhere in the area. Whether it's condos, single family homes, inside the city and the suburbs, it's great. Interest rates were extremely low, and then in 2022, 2023, rates started going up again. And so, certain segments of the marketplace, particularly in DC, started to slow down. Condos, and particularly downtown, east of Rock Creek Park, became a much more challenging sales environment. So, versus, let's say, single family homes in Upper Northwest or the close-in suburbs. So you've got to get a good understanding of what the market is, and what the market is for that particular type of property. You've also got to look at, who is the likely buying public for this particular type of property? Is it an investor area, like maybe near GW University or somewhere like that, where you might have a lot of investors looking for properties? Or is it more likely an owner occupant who's going to move in? You've got to think about who the types of buyers are for this particular unit, when discussing value and strategy with whether to list with a tenant in place or perhaps waiting for better market conditions. Half the time I talk to owners who are thinking about selling, yeah, I advise them that maybe right now, especially the last few years, maybe is not the best time to sell. Wait, the tenant's still there, they're paying rent, good tenant, keep them in place, and then wait for a better time. If for different types of properties, that you might come to an opposite conclusion. So, and as far as comps, you're just looking at, similar type properties. It's the regular analysis you do, whether it's a vacant property or an occupied property. But if you can find comps that are similar, if it's tenant occupied, you're looking at other tenant occupied units ideally.
Yeah. And so this whole pricing expectations and the buyer demand has been a big picture and a big conversation, especially the last 9 months or so. A lot of real estate agents that we work with have been reaching out because things haven't been moving, especially like the specifically condos downtown. Different neighborhoods certainly have a different dynamic, but there have been a lot of owners that have shifted to rental because, I mean, in theory, if it's not selling or not in the condition that you want it to sell, you're no longer living there. Presumably, most owners won't want to just leave it vacant. So renting certainly becomes a big conversation in that, and whether or not it's a short term or a long term. And a lot of owners have been locked in at really good rates these past few years, and so holding on to it for the long term is certainly a lot of owners' game plan. And so they may not be looking to list in the next 5 months. It might be a 5-year plan, but those are the conversations that we want to have up front. Because when those pricing expectations start to dip, specifically like 2 years ago or 2022 versus the market now, you may not always see the opportunity to buy low and sell high, right? I mean, some owners will have that conversation of whether or not it makes sense, and it's a true conversation that we often have. And so lots of owners start asking, well, how much is my property worth? And so there is definitely underlying conversations that need to be had. And so as far as the rental market and the general projected cash flow, is the other aspect that we help owners with, because again, we work with a lot of owners, investors, is where are you going to put the money if you did in fact sell? Sometimes it's a conversation that they are intending to pay for college or buy another property, or put it into the stock market, but just kind of knowing that dynamic, because the properties in DC have continued to rise. The current market is a blip, from my perspective, and things will continue to improve. In fact, year over year, DC has had more significant gains than not only the national average, but many other major metro areas, right?
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
Yeah, and so that opportunity cost certainly is something that many need to consider. And of
Yeah.
course, I'll have to plug away, and I'm not an accountant, I'm not an attorney. I can't give tax advice or legal um, direction, but at the same time, knowing what those deductions is as running it as an investment property, certainly need to play to the bigger picture, right?
Yeah,
Um,
Conrad, yeah, as you said, I mean, some homeowners that are considering selling their investment property, it may be a pressure situation where they absolutely have to sell, whether they need to pull it out for some particular use, or it might just be, they're kind of getting a little bit tired of being a landlord, and so, they're considering other alternatives. But they need to look at their financial situation, see what the rental income they're making from that property. If they were to sell it and move it to another investment vehicle, whether it's the stock market or something else, what kind of return are they getting? But they also have to look at the future of that investment. If if it's a condo they own, for example, and it's in a building that might have special assessments upcoming or fee increases due to deferred maintenance. If it's a home, they might have some big ticket items to repair that aren't necessarily going to add to value, like a roof replacement down the road. So they've got to evaluate what, expenses which might reduce their net income every month in the future are coming as well. So don't just think about the present situation, but how might your net income from this investment change in the coming years? And as things start to depreciate, as you may have done a kitchen renovation right before it became a rental, and it's been 15 years. That kitchen's no longer brand new, so that might need some replacement. So you've got to look at the big picture for this as well.
yep, and we're happy to dissect that as we go. Um, so let's talk about moving forward with the tenant in place. Ultimately, everybody will get to that point. Sometimes the market begins to increase significantly, and you want to take advantage of a hot market, whether the tenant's there or not. And so when we often talk about how some of the listed tenant occupied units may get overlooked because they can be a little more challenging to access, right? Again, we talked about the condition, we talked about the knowing notice periods, we talked about generally being able to get in and having that tenant cooperation. But there are ultimately good opportunities for real estate agents showing them to their clients that may get overlooked because of the negative connotation that comes along with it or the extra work that needs to go into it. But from my perspective, as far as who's buying the tenant occupied units, first and foremost, I think statistically, tenants don't have a high percentage chance of purchasing the property if it is in fact presented to them. We're going to get into the notices that we need to give on the next slide, but ultimately, we're going to want to go through what it looks like to be able to make sure they're aware and see if that is even feasible.
Yeah.
But by
For tenant
managing,
occupied purchases, it's pretty rare that it happens, but that's another reason to talk to the tenant up front. I have sold a number of, particularly when interest rates are lower, buying the property is much more feasible than in a higher interest rate environment for the tenant, because a tenant's going to be probably not very interested in paying more to live where they are with a mortgage versus what their current rent is. So that's really changed the dynamic, and I've seen a far fewer tenants purchasing the units that they live in.
and it depends on the tenant and their plans and the property and the market conditions, the lending that they can get. So when we're managing properties, obviously, we generally process their applications and generally and should have a baseline of what their capacity may be, whether or not it's because of their income or potential additional assets, or what have you. So with that said, it is a small majority that have the opportunity to purchase a property if it was to be presented to them, but it's a great first conversation to have, right?
Yeah.
Um, Now, if you go to market, there it kind of also shifts. How many investors are going to want to purchase a property with a tenant in place? They do exist. Numbers generally need to be able to work, right? There have to be certain expectations set around that rent. And so that's the conversation I mentioned earlier about making sure that you know where you are in relation to market. Um, and the terms of the lease and the tenant's expectations, because selling it to a potential investor that may want to keep that tenant, especially on smaller units, that's going to help generate their numbers to the point where they want them. At the same time, most of the units that are lived in should in fact be habitable, so they're not going to necessarily always appeal to the investor that's going to do a flip or build out or what have you. Of course, you may see that on some multi-unit buildings where they have the ability to add additional units, or a house that could use some renovations to bring it back up to market rate. But once they'll inevitably like to have the tenants out to be able to facilitate that, right? And so
Yeah.
that's going to be a bigger conversation to have. And then, of course, the majority, I'd presume, from the statistics I've seen, are the ones that are going to want to purchase it and move into it, right?
Yeah.
For their
That is the
personal
most
use.
common purchaser for the types of properties we manage in most parts of the city is
Yeah.
someone who's going to move in. Yeah.
Right. And the overwhelming majority of our clients were living in the property, have leased it out. And so you could follow that logic to be able to anticipate that the future owners would want to take possession of it, right?
Yeah.
We'll dig into those notice requirements and how that works on a future slide. Now, there is that pricing reality, right? Market rate versus a potential discounted offer. I would also ultimately say that the residents that are going to purchase and move into it are probably going to be more aligned with it. Most investors are going to be looking at something below market rate, especially if they have the tenant in place, will inherit them, and then, of course, needing to make sure those numbers are clean. Um, but then we also look at how clean those deals are and how convenient they are, right? I would venture to say that there is additional timelines, there is additional paperwork, and since we're going to dig into it in a little bit, I'm not going to go too far into it depth just now, but you got to make sure that you are building the buyer's expectations in terms of what is going to be the big picture and the potential timelines. I mean, as you hear a lot of mortgage lenders be able to say, we can close in 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks, whatever it may be, or all cash buyers are coming to say, I can close in 2 weeks. Obviously, from a transactional perspective, that's ideal, but there are certain timelines we have to adhere to in order for a transaction to go through cleanly, right? So why don't you expand upon the tenant's rights, especially here in DC, because we recognize Maryland and Virginia are different. And we're, for the purpose of this, speaking only about single family, uh, one resident or multiple residents on one lease within one property. I'm not getting into the multi-unit right now because that has shifted with the Mayor's Rental Act, but there's still a lot of uncertainty in terms of some of the expectations. So why don't you dig through these points?
Yeah. So, first off, there's the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, TOPA. And so there's a lot of, some people are aware of it, some people aren't. The law changed significantly back in 2018. We could talk about this and we could do a whole webinar on just TOPA and the notice of sale. So we're just going to do kind of a broad overview here. But under the old law, prior to spring 2018, every tenant in a single family accommodation, whether it's a house, a condo, co-op, had a purchase rights and a right of first refusal. In the spring of 2018, the DC Council changed the law. And so now it's a very limited couple of classes of tenants that do have these purchase rights still. And so those would be tenants who signed a lease prior to March 31st, 2018, which is when at the time the law changed, and moved in by April 15th, 2018, and are either elderly, which DC defines as 62 or older, or have a disability. So those types of tenants, do have the right purchase rights. Every other type of tenant does not. And those types of tenants, you have to send them a notice of sale, which is the other big requirement, which DC law requires you to send it, whether it's the agent that sends it or the owner that sends it, within 3 days of soliciting or receiving an offer or forming the intent to sell. So basically, around the time that you're going to market with the place, you do have to send a notice of sale form. And I don't know if Conrad, if you have that form, you can upload it into the chat and people can take a look at that.
Yep.
But that notice of sale is primarily targeted at those classes of tenants that do have those purchase rights. And those tenants have 20 days to reply and provide proof that they are, within those classes, and then that will kind of start the ball rolling on, their particular rights, or assign the contract to a third party who will allow them to continue to rent there. So as time goes on, that's a smaller and smaller group of tenants in DC that would have those rights. But then the other big issue in DC is the notice to vacate provisions. So, let's say you go to market, you have a contract purchaser who's going to move in. You can't just send, if even if it's a month-to-month tenant, you can't just send a 30-day notice to vacate and ask the tenant to leave so you can close on the property. That's not the case. DC has a 6-page notice to vacate form with 4 different components to it that you need to fill out. And again, Conrad, if you can upload that into the chat, people can take a look at it. But just to kind of briefly overview this, you're going to send this form once you have a sales contract in place with a buyer. You have to send the form to the tenant. You have to send the form to the District of Columbia. I, as the agent, would generally do this for my clients. The seller of the property needs to put in the notice of vacate date, so that would be 90 days out from when you're sending it. And also, this is extremely important, you have to put the rent registry number in there. So as part of being a landlord in DC, you've got to have a basic business license, and you also have to register as either exempt from rent control or being under rent control. And so whichever one of those you are, you're going to fill in the rent number there. And DC's changed the process for this within the last year with how it gets done. And so I know it takes a lot of time, at least at present, to get that number, but it's critical to have that filled in so that you can complete the form. And then the owner's got to sign an affidavit, which has to be notarized along with it, where they're saying that they own the property, the name of the tenant, and they have an obligation to notify DC if the contract falls through, to go ahead and then, basically you have to restart over again with the next contract purchaser. The notice to vacate is not going to continue under that scenario. And then the buyer's affidavit also has to be completed, where the buyer's saying that they are going to move into the property and occupy it personally. DC does not want tenants to be displaced just because another investor buyer. It's only if that contract purchaser is moving into the unit. And then there's a certificate of service part of the document that you have to fill out, which is saying how you're sending the form, whether it's certified mail, first class, personally serving it. I always recommend sending it, certified, or having some proof that you sent it is the best way to do it. So those are the primary regulatory hurdles that you have to go through and comply with. And on the back end of this, really it's what the title insurance company who's selling the title policy to the buyer, what they're comfortable with, because they don't want to insure a property where the landlord hasn't done it what they're supposed to as far as compliance with an owner-occupied property. So you really need to be aware of these issues. Speak to the title attorney who's handling the sale, and find out what is going to make their title insurer happy. But just to make sure you go through all the processes completely.
And along those lines, obviously, we're not an attorney. We don't want to give legal advice.
Correct.
And that's where the opportunity to talk to the title insurance company or the title attorneys comes into play, especially on the front end. And the more complicated the situation, the more beneficial it is for you to have reviewed that with them. And of course, buyers have the right to choose where they want to settle, but there's no harm in letting them know that XYZ title insurance company's already been made aware of the situation, and it may be prudent to go through them to be able to make sure the transaction works, because those notices are, like Tom said, can be involved. Sending them first class mail or certified with return receipt, not all tenants receive or sign off on them. So having the capacity to be able to say, I also sent it by the mail, or I hand delivered it, or whatever, to be able to go along with that could go a long way in terms of making sure that they know that the tenant had received proper notification. right?
Yeah, and just another issue with the notice to vacate. So, you send the 90-day notice to vacate, the tenant's got 90 days to move out. Then what's happening with your transaction? Is the buyer who's going to move in, are they willing to close before that tenant's out? Sometimes buyers are not. So then you've got to delay closing, 90 days until the tenant's moved out of the property so they can take it over as vacant. So you've got to understand that as the seller, that this can be a longer time frame than the 30 days you might have expected because that's what the contract says you're going to do. As the buyer, you have to be aware of the fact that if you have a mortgage, you've got a rate lock period, which might be 45, 60 days. And then what happens if you got to go 90 days until the tenant moves out? I mean, I've had situations where a couple times where the tenants moved out literally on the 90th day. If I was there at midnight, I probably would have seen them putting stuff in a U-Haul. So, sometimes they take it to all the way to the limit. So your contract has to be prepared. Your buyer has to be prepared. If you have to pay for a rate lock extension, they got to think about that in advance. So, understanding these notice to vacate provisions and how they might impact your sale, you got to know it up front. You can't have any confusion there.
Yeah. So this is not to talk anybody out of going down the avenue. It is just to make sure that you're planning for the worst and presumably hoping for the best, because we have had a lot of situations that have worked out real well for owners, right? I had two last year that went very well, very clean transactions, one in which the tenants stayed, another which they had, in fact, vacated. But at the same time, you need to know these things, you need to talk about these things, you need to plan these things, correct? And
Absolutely.
so here are a couple of questions that we've had. In fact, I had a couple of these just this week. And so there may be residents that don't want to leave. And I generally find that the ones that have been there longer will have a harder time figuring out what that next step is. And so still work with them, figure out what the expectations are, what the goals are. And then there may ultimately be an opportunity to find them something that may be the same or better, depending on what you have at your disposal. And as property managers, we have a lot of inventory, and sometimes we're able to find something that really does in fact work before we start having these conversations. Otherwise, if the tenant is interested in staying there, you need to make sure that you know what market you're going to be looking at from a potential buyer's perspective, right? And so no, being able to plan that appropriately and making sure that your marketing is kind of tuned towards that degree. Um, Another scenario, this is one that literally was a conversation I had yesterday about tenants that give notice early. So they find out that that you intend to sell the property. And I would anticipate that most instincts are, well, I don't want to deal with the hassle. I'm going to start looking for another place, right?
Yeah.
And so sometimes they may find an alternative housing arrangement, and that may not line up with your intended schedule, right? So I would say look to the greater good. If everything else is working out where we've already done the due diligence on the market, we know that things make sense, then I would expect that you need to plan for them to vacate, especially from a seasonality, maybe a preparation perspective. Work with them, right? I have had some owners that say, well, we want them to stay for the next 30, 60 days. That can become problematic on the back end. That will potentially have a negative impact on the greater good, like I said earlier, right? And that's where you need to know what work needs to go into it in preparation for the sale. Making sure that you have painters lined up potentially, or photographs, or staging, or whatever else. There's always a couple of layers to this conversation that may help it look and show it's the best, if and when those tenants are in fact vacating. And if they intend to stay and you're going to work around them, you obviously need to make sure that you have those conditions satisfied on a regular basis. So I think we've really dug into why planning matters, right? Between the notice periods and the general condition and the repairs and the listing. I mean, all of these things play to the bigger picture to make sure that everything lines up and is streamlined so that you can help avoid the surprises, right? On both sides, on all sides. So as a quick plug, I know that next month we're going to be going over the general condition of the housing market in DC. I think a lot has been changing. It's good to have a refresh. It is spring, or we're almost there. I think many people reflect on the last couple of days, expecting we're right there, but we're getting there. I want to go over a handful of things and what we're seeing in terms of tenant migrations, neighborhood shifts, and some economic indicators that may help influence some of these decisions as we get into the warmer months. Feel free to click and pre-register. We'll also share this out as a follow-up to the recording for it. So, skip the slide. So let's go from the beginning to the end. So if an owner is beginning to think about an exit strategy, let's just do a quick high-level overview. Tom, you want to tackle this? Or you want me to cover it?
Sure, yeah, I could. So yeah, again, first you're going to start with looking at the lease, see how the lease is going to impact your access to the property, your where you are in the term, so are you close to month to month? Are you 11 months away from renewal? Getting an understanding of that, and then looking at the unit, speaking to the tenant, finding out what their perspective is or what their plans are. As the starting point, you're going to do a market and financial analysis as you do with any property, reviewing the comps, discuss compliance review, making sure the property's got the BBL and that you're taking care of the notice of sale and the TOPA, documents that you might have to do. And then when you're getting ready to go to market, have a good communication strategy with the tenant as far as access, when you're going to do showings, when you're going to do open houses, to try to make things as simple as possible. And then, you got to figure out what is the most likely pathway that you're going to go. If it's vacant, going to be coming vacant during the time of the sale, or if it's occupied. If you have an investor buying the property, then you don't have to worry about any of this notice to vacate provisions because they're just going to be buying the property as is, and the tenant doesn't get displaced. They're just going to take over the lease. So, that's kind of the basic overview of how we go about this.
Yep. And so as we chart those paths, let's talk about how our role as property management comes into this relationship. I mean, ultimately, we're working on having smoother relationships with the tenants, right? We are property managers, but we are also experienced sales professionals, right? We've got decades of experience, especially with this dynamic. We build relationships and rapport with the tenants so that it's an easier conversation when that day comes. Though we also have found ourselves in situations where a third-party agent may become involved, and that does make for the conversation having one more person in it a little more, but it's very manageable in terms of who's doing what and when they're going to be doing it. But ultimately, that is working towards being the trusted advisors to our owners and our fellow agents that helps promote the smoother showings, the tenant cooperation, and generally smoother transactions altogether. And so if owners are out there managing themselves or begin to have these conversations, there's a great opportunity for us to help with the management pre-sale. And without digging too much into the multifamily, numbers are especially critical with that as well, right? And so making sure that you have accurate reporting of the income and the expenses associated with that property are really important to be able to show to the prospective buyers. And many owners that are doing it themselves may not have the capacity to keep clean record keeping, right? And so we're constantly helping our clients evaluate those options and objectively, right? We're looking at all of the things that we've talked about and the potential timelines and helping to make sure that the leases are running on those schedules. Because the DC, and I've referenced it before, has seasonality to the market. If a lease is coming up due for renewal in January, it may be better to kind of shift it into the spring or the summer, right? Overall, sales and rentals are more productive when people aren't in hibernation mode like we've been the last 4 months, right? And so,
Yeah, and just to jump in there, if you're selling a property, and again, you've got to look, every property is different, what part of town it is, what type of property it is. But sometimes if it's a unit, say, that's in a high investor part of the city, GW area, where there's a lot of investors buying units, You might want to structure that lease so it ends in the summertime, because that I have found is the best time to list a property there, because you have a lot of students moving out, new students in. Some families might buy a unit for their for their child that's going to school there. So sometimes you can be very strategic with the way that you structure the lease to end at the right time of year, to go to market. Besides just, looking at spring as the best time of market, there might be a better time for that particular type of property.
Yep, yep. So those evaluations really do hold a lot of weight in terms of what those expectations are. And like I said earlier, navigating the compliance, working with the tenants, knowing the market realities, which I'll expand upon next month. But then there, of course, there's also the reducing risk. And there's the potential for the wasted time. If you don't do all of this due diligence, you don't have all of your ducks in a row, there could be a lot of spinning wheels, and we see that regularly with places that are days on market, much longer than the general averages. And I think that also has an important part, which we didn't really touch on too much, about agents showing tenant occupied units or clients being interested in showing tenant occupied units, because when most are scheduling their appointments and trying to see a bunch of places, it's staggered, it's laddered, right? And so not being able to get in at a certain time may take it out of the conversation. But what have you seen in terms of agents and showing tenant occupied units over the years?
Yeah, so again, that goes back to the 48-hour notice provisions. Sometimes agents are looking at the last minute with their clients. They might be in town just for that day, and they've got to schedule a showing on short notice, but you can't get in. So that can cause complications. You got to make sure to put in the remarks section of the MLS, that you need proper notice in order to get buyers in there. It's also, we typically do a 3D Matterport for everything we're selling. So, even without getting in to the unit, a buyer can do a walkthrough virtually. So that can be a good way to get around these access issues. But regardless, you've got to have that well planned out with the tenant and make sure that buyers in the marketplace know that they might need a little bit more time to get access to the unit.
All right. Well, I mean, we could talk for days about this as we always do, but at the same time, I'm mindful of everybody's time, and certainly welcome to continuing the conversation if you want to dig into the specifics of your situation. But I appreciate everybody coming, and I wanted to leave a little time here for the couple of questions that I had come through and make sure that we knock them out. And so one person on here said that elderly resident, even though those who did not meet the 2018 deadline had TOPA rights. So rephrasing that, elderly residents do have additional, excuse me, opportunities under the law. So what do we do differently for the elderly and disabled that that would not be required for a resident that doesn't fall into those categories?
Yeah, so if it's an elderly tenant, then they might have the rights to stay longer in the unit. So you've got to plan that out, and you're more likely going to be selling them to an investor purchaser rather than an owner occupant, because of the ability to displace that tenant. So yeah, so that's why you've got to really plan in advance, figure out what type of tenant you have there, what difficulties that might impose on your sales strategy. So yeah, so you gotta determine that in advance.
Mm. All right, so two easier questions. TOPA, the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, is what we're referring to as far as TOPA. And then for those that may have buyers that
And that's
want to
just
keep.
DC, not in Virginia. There's a question: is TOPA apply in Virginia? Nope, just a DC law.
Okay. And then, of course, if you have a buyer that wants to keep the tenant in place, great, right? One resident not displaced, but you will need to make sure that you transfer over all the relevant information, tenant's name, contact info, presumably a lease ledger or payment history. The security deposits would need to be transferred, keys need to be transferred. So make sure that you bundle it up so that everything is prepped and ready so that the new owner is in a position to become the landlord without any disruption. And quite frankly, I have a lot of owners that sell to other investors that retain us as property managers, which means that we don't have to worry about all that stuff. We're able to facilitate it internally so that it's almost seamless for all the others involved. Okay, what if the tenant's lease is up and living month to month? Great opportunity, great timing. Still need to do some additional conversations with the tenant to talk it, but gives you more flexibility. What can you expand upon that?
Yeah, again, that goes with the month to month. You can't send a notice to vacate like you could in Virginia or other parts of the country. If you wanted to get the unit vacant, you can't just send them a notice to vacate. It's got to be under the provisions of the 90-day notice to vacate with a contract purchaser in place for most types of buyers. But the month to month does give you the flexibility. If you've, got 10 or 11 months left on the lease term, then that tenant has the right to stay there. I remember one time owner contacted me and said, "We just renewed 12 months last month, but I need to sell. It's September and I've got to get it sold by the end of the year." So in that case, and this was during COVID, the tenant had no interest in leaving. So we had to negotiate with the tenant. They have to agree to it. But, we gave a discount on rent for a month or so and, assisted them with finding a new property. There ended up being a rental that came available a couple blocks away that was more suited to their needs. So again, it's about having a good relationship with the tenant, maybe bending, over backwards a little bit to accommodate them to get the unit vacant. But otherwise, you don't have that flexibility if you're still in the middle of a term lease.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining. Thank you, Tom, for assisting here and expanding upon a lot of the ins and outs of what you need to be considering. So whether someone's planning to sell in the next month or 5 years from now, I mean, it's a valuable step to simply evaluate the situation, and we're happy to do it. The earlier you get going on these conversations, the earlier it is, easier it is to plan. And so I appreciate everybody that joined. And if anybody has any specific questions or looking for some guidance, I'm happy to take it offline. Thanks again.
Thanks,
See
everyone.
you on the next
Appreciate
one.
it. Good talking today.
Thanks.